We are live now.
Great. So this is the subcommittee on NEB, net energy billing of the EUT committee. And we've been doing a variety of things, trying to work through this process. Jordan, I don't see any attendees in there. Whoops, no, I do. Actually, I see 9 people. Good. So the message got out, and what I kind of want to go over with everybody is kind of where we're at, and I think what we have to do next. So we've spent some time, and I've been pressuring Phil and Dan to try to get some numbers back to us. If you recall right, I pinned them down, or we tried to pin them down on some numbers that if we were using their charts on how much DG we would want to bring onto our system, and they came back with some numbers around 790 DG in the system that we would want. And then I have asked them to try to get some numbers on what is in the pipeline, what is in the queue, what stages they're at, what are the benchmarks and things like that. So I call this back together because I think they've started to get some information. It may not be complete, but I wanted them to get back the information to us so we could begin to do stuff with it and talk about our decision-making process and talk about our options and see what more information we need to get. So this is kind of report back for you guys, Dan and Phil, just to let us know what you've been able to find out about what's in the queue where. Who wants to start? Dan?
I can start. Phil, did you have anything you wanted to say before I jumped in? Okay. Sorry, I just inhaled my lunch, 2 o'clock lunch. So, okay. I'm going to share my screen. I'll send these slides afterwards. You see that okay?
It's just a blank screen. Oops, there we are.
Okay. So I think it's been a few weeks, since we've met, and so wanted to provide an update on what is in the interconnection queue for the utilities, and it's pretty similar to what would have been discussed by this group previously. I wanted to show that as we get into the second quarter, you can see that there's a drop off in what is in new projects being proposed. There was some 2021 first quarter, some projects entering the queue, but at least as of the end of last month, that has significantly slowed down, and you can see that kind of in this final bar over here. So there's 2497, so 2,500 megawatts in the interconnection queue as of right now. So by utility, there's 2,000 roughly in the Central Maine Power interconnection queue. Again, similar trend. It's the same chart, but just for CMP, a real slowdown in this last quarter. Within that, there are, this is of those projects, how many of them have an interconnection agreement. So you get into the queue and then you work on getting an agreement. 982 megawatts of that do not have an interconnection agreement at the moment. There are a variety of reasons for that, of which the industry could probably better explain, or utilities or Phil, but about half of that does not have an agreement. Similar charts for Versant. So again, about 540 megawatts in Versant's interconnection queue. Not a significant amount of additions in the second quarter of 2021. And of their 540, 276 do not have an interconnection agreement. So this is looking at that information, but looking at not just what doesn't have an agreement, but what has a net energy billing agreement. So net energy billing agreement, you have to either have that interconnection, that ISA, or you have to have 90% of your offtake contracted. And so there are, 90 or so NEB projects that are operational in CMP, 963 that have an NEB agreement. So it's a little bit more than kind of the previous chart that you could see, and then 150 or so that have a NEB agreement pending. So some of the conversations have been, which we'll talk about, have been in this subcommittee, and other conversations have been what has a contract with an off-taker. And so this subset of projects to get to this stage would either have to have an interconnection agreement or would have to have 90% of their offtake signed up. So you can see the same numbers for Versant. So there's about 1,500 megawatts that have an NEB agreement, or that minus 200 that have an NEB agreement. There's about 200 that have an NEB agreement pending. So with those numbers, if you have an NEB agreement, sorry, I'm going through a lot here, so feel free to ask me questions and as we go. But if you have that NEB agreement, you are going to be in one of the programs. You either be in the kilowatt hour program or in the tariff program. And so this is just a breakdown of those 1,500 megawatts. What program are they in? Tariff program is the most popular in CMP's territory, and the same in NEB, but you can just see the breakdown of those projects. I think, and I don't want to misspeak, and so the industry should, and others should feel free to interrupt me, but I think if you are in the tariff program, it's probably likely that you have that off-taker identified, or potentially more likely. And I only say that because I think in the kilowatt hour crediting program, there could be community shared projects that are looking to establish their customers. It could be residential, could be hundreds of residential customers, and that customer acquisition process takes longer. So I just point that out.
Dan, could you just go back, if you could, Dan, go back a minute and just give us a refresher on the difference between the two programs, the kilowatt hour and the tariff. How do they operate?
The tariff program is a cash. I don't have the specific slides in front of me to describe them as accurately as I should, but it is going to a commercial, a non-residential customer, and it's not a netting or a crediting program that those funds are going to those off-takers. The crediting program is really the credit on the bill. And Phil, I don't know if you're better prepared to answer that than I am, but
Bill?
Yeah, I think it's generally it. The tariff break program is where we're basically paying them that cash, the 12 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour. And the kilowatt hour program is treated more like behind the meter. So it is sort of reducing load, and people are receiving a credit for supply and the related delivery charge on their bills. But they're not getting a cash payment. They're getting sort of an offset of what they're using.
Okay. So the kilowatt hour will be used by a lot of people that are consuming their own electricity, and they're going to use those credits for electricity in the future. Is that fair to say?
Well, it depends. The traditional net energy billing, right, is where you have solar panels on your roof, and it's literally just offsetting your demand from the grid. Here, where you have, say, a 5 megawatt project, they have subscribers, and each of those subscribers is going to get a share every month of the output that will have the effect of reducing their bill. And then they make a separate payment to the project sponsor to cover their share of the costs.
Okay. I see a couple of questions from Steve and then from Trey. We'll do them in that order. Steve?
Thank you, Senator Lawrence. For either of you, so the programs that are going out and soliciting people with the offer of 15% off on their bills, that would be the actual kilowatt hour program. Is that correct? That
Yes.
just that one.
Yep.
I mean, that's okay. Thank you.
Trey?
Thank you. And to be clear on the credit that the utility would be issuing, are they issuing the credit in the amount of the offset in the generation costs, or is it an offset of the total cost of kilowatt hour to service that property, which would include those other fixed costs like transmission and distribution?
It includes both. So it's as if you didn't use the power. So you're not being charged either the supply cost or the related delivery cost. There is the fixed sort of minimum payment for your delivery charges. They would still pay that. But the part of the delivery charge that is charged on a kilowatt hour basis, that would be eliminated. So when we calculate the cost, that's what we're talking about. It's that delivery cost that's forgiven that's going to get shifted to other people.
And just as a follow-up, if I can,
Yep.
Mr. Chair. So then on the other side, on the tariff side, that let's say it's 15 cents, is capturing, is that the same? Are we talking about the same thing again in that model where it's the total cost, the generation, the transmission and distribution, or are we just talking about the generation cost?
Which is just a generation, because they're not paying delivery charges in the same way that a residential customer is. So basically we're buying the electricity. So we're buying the output of that facility, and then whoever's getting the credit for it is getting that financial dollar credit. And then the utility will sell the energy into the market, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to sell the capacity as well.
And that rate is full retail, but 75% of T&D, right? Phil, set every year.
Right. It's based on it's based on the delivery rate. And this is why it's likely to go up over time. Because if the program ends up adding cost to the delivery charges or there are other delivery rate increases, that 75% of the delivery rate is just going to keep climbing.
Okay, so if I can clarify, because I feel like I just heard two different things. So on the tariff side, you are talking about the tariff side, correct? Still. So if the retail price from a utility is 15, let's say it's 17 cents, they then get the 75% discount on the T&D, and that's how you're getting to the 15 cent number in that hypothetical.
Right. So basically, yes. It's basically yes. It's a certain. It's the 15 cents is sort of the all-in price that includes both, but it's built off of the supply and the delivery.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry to get you off track, but you can go ahead, Dan.
I appreciate Chairman Bartlett helping me on a Friday afternoon. Spent a lot of time looking at charts and numbers, so I appreciate that. So as you've heard, I think somewhat in the last committee meetings and just kind of feedback that we've gotten around kind of how to manage this, it does feel like there's support for some sort of pause for these larger projects. I think we've heard from a number of different interested, both kind of project developers, but off-takers as well, from municipalities to, businesses in Maine, the desire to protect investments in contracts already in place to the maximum extent possible. And then moving forward, some sort of exemptions for projects under a certain size. The idea of 2 megawatts has been thrown out. The idea of 1, the idea of 660, as was done previously, kind of what this interim period looks like, some sort of exemption for size or location. So I think, there's a lot of details that go with what might be the most acceptable to the most folks or what might be acceptable, but those are the summary of some of that feedback. And I think a lot of the conversations have been around what is safe harbored and kind of where the line is drawn. So some suggestions, as you know, have been if there were to be everything allowed in that had a interconnection queue position at the end of last year, it would be 2,200 megawatts. If it was end of last year, net energy billing agreement, it'd be about 1,300 megawatts. you saw the previous number of what's in the queue now for net energy billing. It's close to, the 1,500. And that I think is seen as those are potential, pick whichever date, if it's last year, if it's now, as a starting point. And then I think what other discussions have been around attrition. I think there's been a lot of discussions with folks around, again, what the attrition rate will be, but then also kind of what project development milestones could be put in place to help winnow down that number to focus on, again, what I think the consensus is around is generally focusing on projects that have those off-takers will begin construction that are the most mature, and then allowing, ensuring that the market can, those projects that are maybe just getting in are not necessarily the, those could potentially be captured in a future program. That is not broad consensus. I've heard from a number of different interested parties on all sides of the issue, but wanted to mention that. And then I think the conversation we just had around, we really do have these kind of distinct programs. And so if we're going to set milestones or project development criteria, we need to consider the difference between a tariff program and a community shared program, where the customer acquisition on hundreds of residential customers takes longer than the tariff program.
So go
the
back
suggestion,
1 second, Dan, if you could.
Yep.
So on the second bullet point, the net energy billing agreement date. So when you say the 1,300, we still don't know how many of those will drop off because they won't be effective. They won't just be able to get the follow through to get completed, correct?
right? Yeah.
Okay. So if
And
the
I think
attrition was 50%, it'd be much, we'd only get 650. If the attrition rate was 25%, we'd get, something around, I would say almost 1,000.
I think that's fair. And I think that, the other, it's on previous charts, so I didn't include it here, but if we were to use today, and it would be 1,500 megawatts, and then could, so that those are some of the areas to consider.
Yep. Okay.
And I just would note that, there'll be some slides coming later, but you're starting to talk about the more advanced you are in the process, the less the attrition rate you'd expect, right? So if 50% of the total queue might face attrition, once you start getting to folks who have their interconnection agreements already, or if they've been through, they have their NEB agreements, that rate of attrition you would expect to decline with each step.
I get that. Yep.
So if you once you think about when the safe harbor date is set, let's assume that some sort of pause date is set. The idea around performance criteria has included things like you need site control in order to get into the queue, but reaffirming that and making sure that those could set some criteria for what that means, or how advanced that is. If could also, we're going to talk about the utilities have provided some information about what's made it through the I-39 process, which is the interconnection or the study process that goes forward goes through Rest of New England. Could look at some sort of payments made or require payments to be made in order to move forward. Again, the permits discussion, state or I think even potential municipal permits, some of those will knock some projects off. And so there could be requirements in order to do that. And then even some, you have to be completed and mechanically operational by a certain date. Have been other areas of consideration. I will note that right now the rules require once you have a net energy billing agreement, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have 2 years in order to get constructed. And so there is also that mechanical operation deadline already built into the program. I skipped this because I think we've kind of already covered a lot of this, but we did in conversations with utilities, and I would ask that if there are questions about some of this, to go to them. We asked for a little bit more information about trying to get maturity points reflected here, and I think so that what has an I-39 approval, so that's approval from the ISO process. That is kind of another sign of project maturity, at least further along in the process. I think some would rightly point out that that doesn't necessarily mean that a project could have just been in the queue recently, but caught the end of this process and going through, depending on when something was processed through the ISO process, would be, anyway, kind of where this could be. But there are 478 megawatts of projects that have made it through the I-39 process and have an NEB agreement for CMP. So I think it's fair to say that since they've cleared that hurdle, those are probably have the least remaining, at least kind of hurdles on the at least the I-39 and the interconnection piece. And I'd happy to be corrected by others if they disagree. Again, this is done in a way oftentimes where a cluster of projects is selected to go forward, and not necessarily by how they came in or where the project is. But these are the numbers from CMP as of at least a week or two ago. So 477.
It would appear that this includes basically the projects that aren't getting caught up in the cluster studies. So the ones that are more complicated, or there's more of them on a particular substation, those are held up. And I think it appears that these are the ones that were able to slide through and are pretty well, what I would call sort of shovel ready, in the sense that the path is clear if they can get their permits and financing and those other pieces.
And then similar numbers for Versant. They provided this by district, but overall it's about 132 megawatts that have NEB agreements that have cleared the I-39 hurdle. So 132, 477. So that's 6-ish that have gone through this process. And that's the last slide I had. That was just attempted to summarize a lot of information. We've gotten a lot of really good feedback from a number of different parties. I've gotten a number of different suggestions for, including just as of like 2 hours ago from some folks in the industry, with ideas about how to set fair performance criteria that can be, I think what we've heard is, simplicity is helpful, or at least clarity is helpful. And so we've gotten some more feedback just in the last couple of hours from interested parties.
Any questions from the subcommittee members about this data? I don't see any. I had a couple of different ideas I'd like to explore, at least have throughout for us to talk about. Now, this is pure. When you gave us the 790 number, correct? That was pure NEB projects, correct?
Yeah, so our RPS study indicated 760 megawatts.
I forget what
total.
It was.
Yep.
760, yep.
Yep.
Now, there's a certain amount we're considering as potentially for the criteria of storage, some kind of generation combined with storage. Do we know if any of these projects have also included that storage component?
So I think that they, many, at least at the beginning stages of the program, included storage, thinking that there would be a storage adder. They have many of them have since peeled the storage components off, given that an adder did not come to fruition. Some have, you're allowed to do that and not lose your place in the queue. Thanks to a clarifying rule from the PUC early on. So projects that are on with storage now, I don't have the number in front of me, are not, they could be moving forward with storage, but they also have the ability to take the storage component off in a future date. So they could just be waiting until they're a little bit further along. Right now, one thing to be mindful of is I believe the rules would be if you add storage back on that you might then go to the back of the line, but I'm not entirely exactly clear on that piece. But
So I'm kind of thinking kind of in my basic, kind of trying to get my head around this. If we had 760 in DG we wanted to generate, but we also wanted 60 or 100 or how much ever we wanted with DG and storage. If we gave the option for some of these projects to move over to DG with storage without losing their place in the queue, that would help us protect more projects, is what I'm thinking. And I guess I'd just like a reaction from you and Dan and Phil and from other committee members of the subcommittee. And is that even possible to do that?
I mean, I think that considering storage is absolutely something we need to do. Whether we can do it, whether it might be easier to do prospectively, might be one thing to think about. But I'd be happy to hear others' thoughts on how best to integrate it.
Steve?
So, Senator, what I'm thinking I hear is you're saying that rather than provide an adder to incentivize storage, you would give as an incentive the opportunity to, let's say, keep or increase the number of megawatts of projects that we might not stop or would allow if they include storage. So what I'm getting at is there wouldn't be an increased cost due to the fact that storage is being added. It would only be that we might allow, or in our final structure, we might allow a larger amount of projects than what might happen without that storage piece. Is that what you're saying?
That's potentially one way to think about it. I'm not committed to that idea. I'm just saying in all of this, part of what we want to do is to encourage DG, but we also want to encourage DG with solar. And we're solely looking at this from a DG aspect. And if there's some way that some of these projects can fit in under the criteria of DG and solar and not be under that criteria of pure DG, I think we may be able to, and I think you're right, protect more projects in the process. So I haven't gotten it far as to think about the adder and any compensation that way, but I was kind of trying to throw that into the equation and throw that into our thought process. Nicole?
Thank you. I think this is an interesting question, but what I recall hearing at the storage bill hearing was that the reason that storage is getting cut off of all of these projects ultimately is that it's just not financially viable at this time. So I don't think there's going to be an incentive for us to say, oh, you can stay in the queue to build a non-financially viable project, but like, we'll let you do it. If you do that, it doesn't, I don't know if that really rings true. I don't know that people are going to keep storage unless there is some other adder, because they will, it sounds like, lose money on that combination right now. And I also don't know, from some of the analyses that I've read, I'm not sure that we're at a critical point where we need a lot of storage. It's a good idea to start having it in certain places, but whereby we're not actually managing our grid in an intelligent fashion. I don't know that we should be really enthusiastic about spending a lot of money on storage where I don't think it can play the role that it hopefully will in the future to balance the demand and the load and the timing of all that.
Any other thoughts? Is there some advantage to, if somebody included storage in their project, giving them a priority on interconnection?
I think part of this, I think, is going to be whether we're looking at prospectively or not. I think I would have to hear a little bit more from the developers in terms of what sort of is out there for storage potential.
Okay. I mean, I don't want to get us sidetracked, but these are thoughts that kind of rummage around my mind as I think about NEB at night when I have nothing else to think about.
Yeah. And I agree with you. And I think that then part of this goes to, like, if you're looking to a future program, really thinking about where it makes sense to bring DERs onto the system, where there's the maximum locational benefit, and also where storage could be used or paired to get more in a particular area where it's needed, or to provide some other grid benefits based on where it's located. So I think there's a lot of important work to be done here, but I do think that to get the maximum advantage, we're going to need a little more work on the grid modernization side of things.
Steve?
Yes, I agree with that, and I think that when we get to that piece where we're looking at storage, we need to make sure that we carefully consider, as you pointed out, where it's needed, what we really need to spend to incentivize it if we do, so on and so forth, more carefully before we jump into it than we did with NEB, and just to make sure that we look at the unintended consequences as well as what we want to do. So I think I was just looking at if there's already storage being built for various reasons, and some of it is financial incentive because they can sell that power back at a good rate. But so I'm reluctant to incentivize more storage at this time with this NEB, whatever we come up with for a final policy. But it's just something to think about. I agree with Senator on, this is a good time to think about what we're doing here and how that may come into play. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I think you're right. And with DG, we're going to need storage because electrical use is not always needed when the sun shines. So same thing with wind. We're going to need storage with that. We're going to need storage with a variety of these renewables. So I would just kind of hoping to introduce that into the conversation, and maybe we can hear, between now and the next meeting from some of the people in the industry, what they think about that, or whether it's possible or whether that's at all feasible. So just to kind of try to move things along, we've got some numbers back from Dan and Phil. We've got some options laid out there on, where we can start to think about benchmarks. I think we've got to try to move to a point where we reach some kind of understanding about what's the amount of NEB we want to safe harbor at this point. And I'm not expecting a decision today. I think we've got to absorb some of these numbers and think about it. But it seems to me the next step is to say, okay, how much NEB do we want to safe harbor? And then what do we use for milestones for that? Does that sound reasonable for the subcommittee? And I don't think anybody wants to lay a number on the table. Nicole, maybe you do?
No, I mean, I think that's a helpful framework because we've got to start somewhere, but I think that the cut points do need to be logical, not just based on us trying to target a number, because it's really, in my view, all of our collective responsibility that we're in this circumstance. And so, and that includes the executive branch as well as the legislative branch, not really the PUC so much. So we appreciate your help in thinking about it. I want to make sure that we don't just draw a line based on trying to get to a number, but that the line also makes sense based on the investments that were made in this program that we opened up to the world to be a part of. I mean, this is our responsibility to honor some of that commitment.
Just out of curiosity, Nicole, and not to pin you down too much, but did you see any lines there that made logical sense to you?
I will admit I would need a little more time, and I want to publicly apologize to all the people who have emailed me their specific proposals, and I have not emailed them back because they were just too much to handle at that point in time. But so I'm not in a position to say. I think I've seen some proposals that make logical sense to me, but I don't know how they all fit together. And I guess I would be interested in hearing from Director Burgess about, you mentioned that there were a lot of proposals that came in front of you. If you have any sense of lines, good proposals that you've seen in places to draw lines based on investments made, and knowing that we will hopefully have a net energy billing 2.0, and some of those projects could slide into that if they're only just in their infancy. If you had any recommendations for some places to start.
Dan?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think knowing that I got one or two of them about an hour ago, we'll need, want to look at some of those. I think it's going to be the balance of cost to main ratepayers and the benefits of solar / protecting, investments that have been made. And I think that's the balance that will need to be struck. I think if you look at NEB agreements within that, kind of what has offtake contracts and development milestones, you can start to piece some of that together. I think that, when that NEB agreement was reached, you'll hear all sides, or when an offtake agreement has been reached, and then the balance of what cost or ratepayers could be. But I think it's somewhere within some of those areas that, and that's what some of the suggestions have been, and even kind of bills before EUT even last week, looking at other ideas around. But I think it's somewhere in that nexus.
Steve?
Thank you. Well, not to get too practical here, but I think some of the things that we also want to look at, or a few of the things, might be the projects that are in the queue and the things that Mr. Burgess already mentioned. But we also need to look at how much do we need when. In other words, some of those projects are going to be ready soon. What can be accommodated by the utilities when. In other words, there are some places where these projects are set to be established that connection is very limited, but maybe in 1 year or 2 years, some of those projects could come online or be accommodated. How much do we think that we are willing to spend of the ratepayers' money that we previously committed to, but now know we maybe shouldn't have? So there are several factors, but some of those are practical factors that might whittle down some of the projects in the queue if we set the boundaries, the goalposts, whatever you want to call them, with those things in mind. And for example, if there's a local project and the substation, there's probably no way that substation is going to be rebuilt in 5 years to accommodate that project. No matter where it came in the, in our ranking system, if you will, that might be something that would throw it out for this particular consideration. So I think there's a few of those things that we can maybe look at as well.
Steve, if you have some ideas in that regard and you want to put, kind of pen to paper and start to put down your ideas and share them, that would be great. Trey, I think you had your hand up there for a while.
I did. I'm just sort of thinking about, possible ideas. And I mean, one of them is, frankly, that there was a component, at least in some regards, built into the original law that was passed in 1711 in terms of what the point at which is that we should be, considering drawing a line. And that was met fairly early on. So there might be justification to not look at that. But in terms of, I think it depends. Are we looking at size? Are we looking at location? Are we looking at a date? Because whatever route we go, we're going to have to justify it somehow. But I think it's fairly easy to back into, well, this is what the law said when we passed the original bill, and it gave us a look back, or at least a review, right? It didn't say that we had to halt all projects after the fact, but I think that's probably a starting point.
Are you talking, Trey, about that 10% threshold?
Yeah, I believe it was either 10% or 3 years, whichever came first. And obviously that one came first.
Yeah. Nicole, your thoughts?
Sure, yeah. To that point, I've been thinking about that some too. Maybe for Chair Bartlett or Director Burgess, do you have a sense of how much the development community knew that that point had been reached and that the utilities had reported that point had been reached to the PUC? Do you have any sense of what the public awareness was about that?
It was pretty high once it was reported to us.
And what was that date?
Sorry, go ahead.
What was that date, Phil?
I'd have to go back and look, but I must have, it was in the summer, I think.
Okay.
Because that's when we opened the proceeding and started having regular reports filed by the utilities and began doing the work for our NEB report, which was completed in the fall.
Dan, I'm sorry, you're going to say something?
Yeah, just some context around that number. So that was for Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, 10% of the peak load, right? So, and that was for just what was in the queue, not necessarily kind of what was built, and was 10% of the of the capacity, not necessarily the energy. So just some context there, that the way that it was set up, it was the trigger happened once 10% of the kind of queue, what had an ISA, was met. Didn't mean that there was 10% developed yet. It was just 10% that was in line. And that does not actually also take into consideration the 375 megawatt procurement, which was not successful. So you've kind of got that 10%, plus the 375 that was considered in 1711. So just for a little bit of context.
Nicole?
I just wanted to add, I had a note from someone that CMP hit that point on May 20th, 2020, and Burson hit it September 15th, 2020.
Good, thank you. Trey, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, those are dates that I think we may want to look at. And beyond that too is the date that the PUC actually published the report, right? Because that would be at that point, I sort of view that as the time that folks are put on notice, right? Like we've hit a substantial, milestone here. And, then it became clear, I think there's a little trouble in paradise. And so I think that was if they didn't actually, to not get too legal, but, sort of the actual notice, in my opinion, probably would be when the report actually went out, because at that point they should be aware, if they're doing business in this space and paying attention to what's going on. That would be a date that sticks out in my mind as something to keep in the back of our mind, I guess.
Other thoughts? And just so the people in the attendees list go, I am going to go to see in a little bit to see who has comments, thoughts they want to share. But I'm just trying to get the committee to start to ruminate on some of our options and some ways we could approach this. One of the things I would like to see very much is by the end of this month, us giving the development community clarity, because I think that's what I've heard more and more is that they want clarity. They need to know kind of what's going on in order to go ahead. So I'm kind of ruminating on different ideas, ruminating on different ideas in my head about how to approach this. And is it possible from Phil and from Dan, your perspective, that we could give like immediate green light to a certain group of project, kind of like, a secondary green light to another amount and so on, things that are all ready to go. And we can say these projects, yep, they're good. And kind of, more tentative green light to others.
Yeah, I think you could do that. One thing as you're thinking about this, I mean, I know the cost issue has come up a couple of times today, but just to put it into context, the 760 megawatt figure, sort of that if you think that's the goal of what we need by 2025, or was contemplated by then. If you look at the cost, that would be in the neighborhood of a 15% rate increase. And you're talking over $100 million. And that's locked in for 20 years. So I think as you're thinking about where to draw the line, I think it is of course intertwined with what's the ability to pay. And I think I just want to sort of highlight that because I know that you have a lot of competing priorities that are in front of your committee right now in terms of additional opportunities to invest as well.
So Phil, are you fairly hard and fast on that 15% rate increase number?
Well, I mean, I think there are those who would take issue with it. I think Daymark added some numbers that I believe they would include as sort of offsets or as avoided costs. It's in the range there. I think our report indicated that every 500 megawatts would be about a 10% rate increase. Even accepting the Daymark numbers, you're still looking at north of 7% for 500 megawatts. So we can quibble over exactly where it fits, but I think it's in that 7 to 10% per 500 megawatts.
And that's 7 to 10% in addition to what we would normally have in rate increases.
Correct. Yeah, that's an additional rate impact.
Okay. And does all that rate impact go into effect at one time, or is it spread over time based upon when these projects come online?
They will start as they come online, but it's because it's an amount that you're going to be paying every single year. Once all these are operational, if all of these are operational within 2 years of today, then for the next 20 years, you're going to be paying that amount every single year. And I think that's the challenge. And I think it's particularly true on the C&I side, because that really is just a cash payment that you are locking in, and that's going to increase over time because it is built off of 75% of delivery rates. So there's a potential to see that ratchet up further, which is the danger of that program as it's currently structured.
So to get kind of sideways on a little related subject, peak load, do you see peak load increasing over time in the coming years?
Yes, but the pace of it is a lot less clear. And part of that will likely depend on what programs are put in place to further beneficial electrification and how fast EV come online and what that uptake is. There's likely to be additional investments in charging infrastructure that are going to be needed to enable that. So I think, if I look at like Versant's rate case right now, I don't think they're projecting significant load growth over the next several years. And I think that's at some point you're going to start to see a real jump, but it's not imminent. And I think Dan might have more information in terms of what their projections are showing.
As that load growth grows, does it lessen the impact on rates?
Yes, not in terms of the absolute amount, but it would in terms of the percentage.
Right.
So if you have $100 million in expense, $100 million a year, the more that load growth goes up, the lower percentage that 100 million is going to represent. So absolutely. I mean, I think in an ideal world, right, you time a ramp up. So you could stay, if you decided that 10% was your threshold, your costs would kind of ramp up over time, coincident with your load growth.
Okay. And Phil, do we have any projections from the PUC based upon the laws we've enacted thus far to push people towards more electrification, what load growth is going to be in the coming years?
We haven't done studies ourselves, but there have been some that have done, and I think Dan can probably speak to that more, is more familiar than I do.
Dan?
Yeah, actually the renewable energy study that we did uses the Climate Council's 10-year projections for load growth. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact increase numbers in front of me, but we do have some of that.
If
could provide it.
For the next time we get together, if you could provide those to us, because that's important in this equation, not just the Daymark report, which I think makes many good arguments about why the rate impact is actually less than what you initially projected it to be, Phil. But load growth is going to temper some of this rate impact. And if we talk about, moving the quantity of home heating and cars over to electricity, seems to me, we're going to experience load growth pretty significantly in the future. Other thoughts from the committee? So we did have a bill that came in at the very end about the option of buying out some of these contracts. And I kind of said to the whole committee, EUT committee, we'd take it up as part of this discussion. Just your reaction, Dan and Phil, on what that would mean and how, if at all, that would be structured.
It gets dicey fast because you want to avoid sort of the moral hazard, right, of folks coming in to sell their contracts. So I think you'd have to have a pretty rigorous process for assessing amounts invested when and really think about how you're going to come up with the amount of the buyout. Because I think that's it. It's got to be you'd have to come up with a very rigorous way of evaluating any proposed buyout.
Dan?
Yeah, I guess I'd want to hear more from others about the uptake of that and if that's an attractive option. Obviously, it may not, if you're comparing it to what exists now, it may not be attractive, but if, even if what exists now weren't to exist, would it be a good option that would be considered? I guess I'm not sure. So I need to do a little bit more homework on that front or hear from others.
Okay. Steve?
So I think you're referencing, was it 1596 that we heard the other day?
Yeah, I don't remember bills by their numbers, but it's the one Tony Buxton testified on.
Piazzo?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that had a couple of three different aspects that it addressed, which we're dealing with. One was the number of years, which Commissioner Byler just mentioned is 20, and the bill suggested reducing that to 10, which is probably closer to, I guess, an industry standard or something. But the other one was what you just mentioned, buyouts. And the other one was going from the 5 megawatt down to 1 megawatt project size, which originally that was 667 kW, I believe, before LD 1711. So I think all of those are aspects that we need to consider. And when you talk about increasing baseload, generally speaking, everything I've heard so far is our methodology of doing that is to incentivize that move to electrification, which costs ratepayers money. And I was privileged to sit all morning waiting at another committee for a hearing on a bill. And I heard once again Mike Stoddard speak to the fact that something they were considering would probably boost rates, and that was, he was, as he's mentioned many times, quite often to us, that's going to disincentivize people moving if those rates keep going up. So that's obviously something to keep in mind here. When I saw Representative Piazzo's bill, one of my thoughts was, in spite of the ramifications for contractors and projects, is it time to make a decision where that not everybody's going to be happy, but we've cut our losses and we've restarted at a new point, and where that we will consider these issues going forward more appropriately to trying to incentivize electrification, people moving over to electric vehicles and so on and so forth, while trying not to raise the rates any more than we have to. And that's, I think, the buyout piece of that is, and some of us have been involved in formal lives where we were either on one side or the other of a buyout because it made sense to cut our losses. It's like selling a losing stock, if you will. At some point we have to say, okay, we can't pay for this for 20 years. We've got to find a better way and get on with things. So I think it's still something to consider. Those are the two items I think there as well.
Appreciate that. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but not all the electrification programs are funded by rate-based funding, correct? Some come out of general fund and other places.
Yeah, that's right. So the Volkswagen funds from the settlement are funding some of the rebates and charging infrastructure right now. The next kind of slug of funds for much of that will be from the NECEC stipulation. There's 10 million for electric vehicle charging and 5 million for rebates. And then the other programs could come through proceeds from RGGI or the forward capacity market. And Michael would be better to kind of give the exact details, but they are not all through the system benefit charge. That's right. And then,
and refresh my memory, the 100,000 heat pumps.
That is a mix of funding sources, including some through main housing, LIHEAP dollars. So that is a mix of funds.
But it's not all rate based.
Right.
And that's one point I'd make to your point is that, Steve, is that many of these programs are not rate based. And I know from your perspective, you'd probably say, well, they're still coming out of taxpayer dollars. And that's true. But if we're looking at the impact on rates, they're not all rate based. And the other point I'd make is some of this move towards electrification is going to take place regardless of what we do on rates. When I see GM announce by such and such a date, they're going to be all electric, customers aren't going to have that many more options as they used to. And they're going to be converting to electric regardless of whether they get a rate incentive out of it.
I would agree with that. And I understand that not all of this is rate based, but I think what we're dealing with here mostly is something we're trying to remedy over a very short amount of time compared to what we're talking about in that arena. And that is, we're trying to fix this NEB issue over something between now and maybe 5 years from now time frame. to get this corrected, if you will. And for instance, leaving it at a 20-year guaranteed payment is 20 years of dealing with it versus the short term. So, and also making sure, as you said earlier, that there's some clarification to those who are in the queue, if you will, on where they stand. So
when
but
you
I
talk
understand
about,
it's not all rates.
when you talk about putting on those limitations, you're talking about prospectively.
I'm looking at the whole picture. If we go back to a certain date, if we say here's how much we think we need, if the whole picture, if you will, that it's not going to be palatable to everyone, but I think we have to try to look at the whole scenario, and that would be one of the things that we would say. Now, for those who are already at a certain stage, they were guaranteed 20 years, then that may be the way it is. But I think it's a condition we have to look at, what is somewhat fair in the timeline to say, no, it's going to be 10 years. Gazzo's bill basically said, that would do it, right? Maybe a little harshly, but.
So I get clarity of what you're saying. Let's assume we, for lack of a better word, grandfather people in. You're not suggesting we change the term of years for those people, are you?
Well, that might depend on where you set that grandfather people in limit. In other words, if somebody's at a certain place, they may be very willing, if they can keep their project going, to go to 10 years versus 20. If they've already done, are further along, and it was all dependent on that 20 years, then obviously that's a different situation. So I don't know just how we do that, but I think we need to minimize the damage as much as we can, and those things have to be considered. So.
Okay. Before I go to see if any of the attendees have thoughts or ideas they want to add, does any of the subcommittee have any more thoughts and ideas they want to add right now? Okay, so I'll go to the attendees list. If people have reactions, thoughts, things we missed, things we should be talking about, that you want to add into the conversation, I just ask you to raise your hand. So I see Jeremy's hand up first, so let's go with Jeremy Payne. Can you beam him across, Jordan?
He's on his way.
Great. Are you here yet, Jeremy? Great. Your mic.
Happy Friday afternoon, everybody. I'm here. Simple topics for after a long week for everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. So Jeremy Payne with the Maine Renewable Energy Association. There was a lot talked about. I tried to take notes of, I think, most things that were discussed. So I'll try and give you some reactions to some of those. I guess I'll start by saying, before I dig into some of those specifics, we appreciate this is a very, very difficult situation that you find yourselves in. And the industry itself has struggled to find, to try and be responsive to the concerns and general conversation that you all have had on this topic over the last number of weeks. So you're not alone. It's not an easy answer, but I'll dig into some specifics. So the 10% threshold idea that triggered, that was just to trigger a PUC report. I mean, if that was intended to send a signal to industry to stop investing, then it should have been a hard cap. So, we've kind of already opened up the door to everybody, and to slam the door in their face based upon some arbitrary number that was never clear that it would be a signal to slow down or reconsider, or that your investment would be that much more risky. I think would be a really damaging signal to send to everybody. The second piece, I just wanted to dig a little deeper on the conversations around attrition. I'm happy and encouraged that it seems like there's an acknowledgement that attrition is real. And I'll just give you one recent example that came up in the results from the Winslow cluster study that CMP is doing that indicated they may need to upgrade 42 miles of lines at a cost of $3.5 million. So, you know, without even frankly having direct conversations with people, I can tell you that $147 million cost split amongst a dozen or maybe less developers, that all or nearly all of those megawatts will never get built. So that's just one example. And then I know you also heard yesterday in the context of Representative Chiazzo's bill from the gentleman from Loki Solar, just sort of referencing, if you just take a look at the substations in Versant's territory and knowing that they've got a 12, 15, 18 megawatt max, and then you see substations with a queue of 50, 60, 70 megawatts, those projects are not going to get built. So a lot of the angst and panic about the size of this program, I think, is probably overblown. I mean, obviously you want to be very cautious anytime you start talking about rate impacts, and I know Chairman Bartlett has cautioned you about that, and I certainly understand that. The other piece is I just want to talk, benefits are real. We've spent an enormous amount of time talking about costs and about 5 seconds talking about benefits. I think it's really important that you all consider how beneficially impactful this can be for consumers who are participating in this program, be they residential or commercial. So if you're a bunch of community solar subscribers in a neighborhood, or you and all of your friends or family members decided to subscribe, those benefits are real. If you're Bath Iron Works or Maine Health or some other well-known Maine business or the Maine Community College System or the University of Maine or anybody else, those benefits are real too. And a lot of those businesses, particularly the larger businesses, have already started to book those savings into their future budgets. So you need to be really cautious about what you're doing, particularly if we start talking about shrinking from 20 years to 10 years or changing the terms of those contracts. You just can't do that and have the state retain its business reputation. Clean energy companies won't come back here. I think that's the reality. The other thing is, and I said this a little bit yesterday, I just feel like I want to reiterate it, is, limiting the future of NEB to 1 megawatt means we're asking a 2 megawatt project to compete on price with an 82 megawatt project. That's crazy. That's never going to happen. The numbers just don't work. You start to get some economies at scale at 2, 3, 4, 5 megawatts compared to 660 kilowatts or 300 kilowatts or whatever, but you're not getting economies of scale at 4 megawatts that you are at 104. It's just a completely different reality. And speaking to that 20 versus 10, I mean, a lot of projects were financed based upon a 20-year contract. So the literal interest rate, the cost of developing, building, constructing the project was based upon 20 years. So if we start looking back and say, sorry, we meant 10, we're wrecking deals. Banks, investors, financiers will walk from projects and or ask for significantly higher interest rates to build and construct the projects. And then just a little bit of reference to load growth. I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday, and I hadn't really thought about it in this context, but if you just think about like one long haul electric truck, it would need about a megawatt for fast charging. So now imagine Dysart parking lot on a busy day. You put 30, 40 trucks in there. They're all electric trucks, which, to Senator Lawrence, your point earlier, GM, I think that was mostly passenger vehicles, but eventually the larger vehicles are going to move in that direction too. You put 30, 40 trucks in Dysart's parking lot and they're all on fast chargers, you're going to need 30 or 40 megawatts right there. So I think a lot of what we're assuming now is based upon our knowledge as of May 7th, 2021, not necessarily thinking into the future of what we're really going to need. When we start seeing the actual companies that build and manufacture passenger vehicles and trucks telling us we're not doing combustion engines anymore, we're moving all electric, we should heed that warning and we should plan for it. The other thing to just bear in mind is when we talk about 700 megawatts or 1700 megawatts, you have to bear in mind the capacity factor. How often is that solar going to be available? You're probably talking 15, 20, 25% at most, probably closer to 15 to 20. So when you hear 1,000 megawatts, it sounds like a lot more than operationally it's actually going to be. And then last on the storage piece, I think it's a very interesting idea. I think in order to get storage built in Maine, realistically, we would need an adder. I think that's primarily why when we started to see the queue initially populated, you saw quite a few solar plus storage projects, and a lot of them backed out because the PUC didn't move forward with incentives and adders. So if that's the direction we want to go, and I certainly believe we should, then that incentive and adder is going to have to be there if we want storage to move forward. And then the second piece related to that is just if you have an existing queue position with just a solar project, but you want to add storage, you're going to need to have a conversation around whether telling Acme Corp, if they add a battery storage project to their solar project, does that bump them to the back of the line, or do they get to retain their position in the queue? So I'm happy to answer any questions about any of that. I'm sure other attendees may have thoughts, but those are my initial reactions.
Great. Jeremy, a couple of quick questions. So when I brought it up, I was talking about protecting people in the queue, and I think that's a reasonable trade-off. When you're talking about adders, what are you talking about specifically?
Well, I mean, when LD 1711 was passed, you all authorized the commission to create adders if they so choose. It was permissive language, but the idea was to deliver some project diversity. So projects on landfills, storage, dual use, any number of ideas. The commission did not move forward on that. That's where we are. Other states have. You know, we offered some initial comments in one of the 8 million solar dockets at the PUC around what Massachusetts had done. Obviously, I'm well aware that Maine's 8.5% load is not the same as Massachusetts' 50%. But what Massachusetts did for incentives and adders could have been a starting point for us to have a conversation about basically how do we Maine-ize what Massachusetts, or frankly any other state, has done. But I think what we've learned in Massachusetts is if you do incentivize storage with the right number, people will build it. I mean, obviously you want to make sure it's just enough to get the project built, but not so much that you're just enriching companies for no real reason.
So I just want to make it clear for people who are listening, for adders, you're not talking about Dunkin' Donut coupons. You're talking about adding numbers on the rate, the amount of rate subsidy.
Correct.
Okay.
But I think one of the reasons you do that, Senator Lawrence, is you get benefits beyond just, I mean, you're right. Obviously, at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, you might not need all the solar output. And so that's when the battery comes in real handy. But it also provides real grid management flexibility for our utilities. It also allows us to not have to add additional distribution and transmission infrastructure. If the utilities can manage the grid more effectively and actively and not sort of a set it and forget it approach, that provides real value to every single consumer in Maine, regardless of whether they participate in the NEB programs.
Okay, good. Other questions for Jeremy? Okay, to alternate back and forth, I just ask you, Jordan, to beam Jeremy back over, and we'll go to Tony Buxton. Tony.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you to the subcommittee and others who are participating. We appreciate your hard work, especially on this gorgeous Friday. First request, if the committee is receiving proposals on how to solve this problem, it would be wonderful if those could be shared, because they may incite further brilliance on the part of others. And I understand that a couple of proposals may have been received. Secondly, I want to talk about costs for just a minute. The IECG has not taken a position that this entire program should be killed and effectively retroactively. Frankly, that would be a possible position, but beyond its political challenge, it would also raise another question, and I'm going to come to that as a matter of discussing how the committee might look at this going forward. The costs that you're talking about are troubling because they're large and they are unnecessary. There would have been a slight rate increase maybe if we had bought a lot more solar at 3.5 cents. That's not at all clear and frankly not worth worrying about because it would have been so slight. And that's been the IACG's position all along. So when I hear others talk about all the benefits that come from net energy billing, I just want to remind everyone that we could have had the very same benefits, almost identically the same benefits for a whole lot less. And that's the problem here. So in that context, I ask you to think about the buyout. And what I heard from a couple of members was uncertainty about what it was, how you would do that and why it would work. And I'd like to just spend a minute on that, if I might, Mr. Chairman. The premise here might best be seen if you imagine that you did pass a law or were considering passing one voiding the entire program. There then would be an equity issue about what you do about people who relied on that program and made investments. And what you might do is adopt a statute that allowed the commission, working with the utilities and others, to make people whole for the investment they had made. And that would vary from project to project. For some, it would be, $1,000. For some, it would be $1 million or more. In no case would you pay someone their lost profits, because no one has a right to windfall profits from a statutory program that was a mistake. Now, people will object to that. But as you go forward, I urge you to look at the contracts, the net energy billing agreements that people have signed, not each one, but the two, they're basically 4 contracts for 2 programs for 2 utilities. Those contracts do not require delivery. They have no penalties if you fail to deliver. You have 180 days to get out. That is, you give notice and 180 days later, you're out of your contract. They're very different than other power contracts. And all that goes to the equities, and those go indeed to the kind of program that you adopt on a remedial basis. So our point is that whatever you do, you should do on top of that a buyout program, because it's worked before. In the 1990s, your predecessors adopted a program with FAME and the PUC and the utilities, under which people who had power contracts called PURPA contracts, which these could be called the same thing, operating under state and federal law, were voluntarily allowed to propose buyouts to the utilities of their contracts. And a fair number of power plants that were existing and operating had their contracts bought out, and the contract buyouts had to be approved by the PUC as in the public interest. It worked, and it could work here. And the mere fact that people who are now involved never did it doesn't mean it didn't work before and couldn't work again. It's entirely voluntary. It does require people to, understand the numbers and understand the development of a project, but it's frankly a lot easier than you might think. And here's the dynamic, and I'm almost done, Mr. Chairman. We IACG figure that the typical 5 megawatt solar project costs about 10 cents a kilowatt hour to build. That means that if they're getting paid 14.5 cents, there's 4.5 cents profit, which may be divided up between the sponsor of a tariff program, that is the host, or the customers, whatever. But there's 4.5 cents there. Plus there are the renewable energy credits that are worth minimally 3 to 3.5 cents. All right, so let's figure you've got maybe 7 cents profit. Any developer, other than somebody doing it for a cause, may be willing to consider buying out that project for some portion of that 7 cents a kilowatt hour. And that means you avoid the 10 cents. And by avoiding the 10 cents, you can replace the entire amount of that project for 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So you have an upside potential of 6 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour for 20 years, which all of a sudden adds up. So those are the dynamics, and it's voluntary, and it exercises what Representative Berry has advocated, that we take advantage of public financing because there would be FAME bonds involved, and it could be relatively efficient, and it might diminish the impact on ratepayers. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you for all that time.
Are there questions for Tony? I do have one, Tony. When you're talking about bought solar at 3.5 cents, is that DG Solar built in Maine?
Sure, it's the PUC under your other bill, LD 1494, did an RFP, and there's another one on the street right now. The first one bought, I think it's, and Phil would know better, some 600 megawatts of renewables, most of which is solar, located in Maine.
DG Solar?
Oh, no, it's not DG Solar. But Senator,
Let me just make my point, Tony, is that's what we're talking about here, is the benefits to the grid of DG Solar.
Senator, with all respect, there is virtually no benefit whatsoever to the grid of DG Solar unless you cite it specifically for that purpose. What we have here is a shotgun of siting, not a rifle shot siting. Now, if you have a program where the commission looks at all the projects and says, we want that one, and that one, but not those, that's different. Then that works. But there, I mean, you already have bills in front of you to have ratepayers pay the cost to the developers of connecting to the grid. I mean,
no, I understand. I just
right.
wanted to get to understand what you were talking about for solar.
Right.
And there may be a difference of opinion on policy and the advantages of DG. And
but Senator,
may have to agree to disagree upon that.
We may.
I just wanted to make it clear when you were saying, I understood that to be non-DG solar.
Senator, I appreciate your point, and I understand your policy prerogative, but I will say something else. I defy anyone to show you the actual incremental benefit between 3.5 cents and 14.5 cents from any distributed generation project in Maine. It is not possible.
Okay.
I've been doing this, Senator, for 40 years. Okay. I do a lot of solar, right? It doesn't happen.
Any other questions, Nicole?
Thank you, Mr. Buxton. I really appreciate what you said about the location, the planning, and all being relevant to how effective these projects are to actually bringing us benefit. In your view, just because it's Friday afternoon and I'm feeling crazy, who should be doing that planning? Why hasn't it been done? What do we do to make it happen?
This will be hard for you to believe, but with most of the Maine solar industry, not including the itinerant ones, but including Revision and others, we at Pretty Flaherty represented Tesla in a New Hampshire PUC proceeding that took 1.5 years, which considered that very question. And we won the case, if that can be possible in New Hampshire. And what we won was the ability for the PUC to require the utilities to do that, to cite solar in particular, where the grid would not have to be expanded if the solar were built. And what we found is that you have to go with growth. And that's your point, I think, previously made today. And so as the grid grows, it's entirely appropriate to use distributed generation to diminish the need for transmission. And that's where Senator Lawrence, I think, is right. And the problem is we don't have any growth. And our failure, and the IACG shares in this, in Maine, is we are not adopting programs to grow electricity demand in any way proportionate to our building of renewables. and we do need to do that for all the obvious reasons. It's you've done a good job as a legislature giving the public advocate the ability to do non-transmission alternatives, and it ties right in there. And the answer is it's the job of the commission, and it just needs to be more aggressive, or even more aggressive. I'm sorry to take so long.
You all set, Nicole? Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With your lengthy history, Mr. Buxton, can you answer this question for me in regards to PUC and buyouts? In '87, when the biomass plant was built in West Enfield, around that time, it had, I believe, a 30-year contract based on $19 a barrel oil with CMP. They bought that contract out because oil never got to those levels. As a matter of fact, it went down. Did that buyout have to go before the PUC? Do you know?
Representative, thank you for the question. And I'm going to talk to my friend Tom Edison, who's sitting right next to me here. That's how long I've been around. I don't remember that specific project. That's the problem of having been around so long. There certainly were a number of biomass, hydro, and other projects, most typically standalone, like the plant you mentioned. You know, standalone, they had no benefit of cogeneration. They weren't tied into a manufacturing facility, and therefore were more expensive. I don't recall if it, well, let me say it this way. I think every buyout has had to go before the PUC. I'll state that. Because the utilities wanted to know they could recover the costs of the buyout in stranded costs, and they were virtually uniformly allowed to do so after a lot of scrutiny by the PUC.
Any follow-up, Steve? Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, Tony. And I see we'll beam Tony back across. We'll see Michelle Carpenter and see if we can beam her over. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yes. Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good. So I guess I just wanted to first just correct one discrepancy, and you know, I think there's a lot of other distinctions between DG solar and utility scale, but I do think it's very important to point out that when you're looking at a utility scale contract, you are looking at a supply only rate. You know, that does not include transmission, which would be layered on top of that, and distribution, which would be layered on top of that. Whereas, you know, when you're talking about a DG scale solar, it is inclusive of distribution and transmission. So I just wanted to throw that out there just right off the bat. You know, there could be a very lengthy conversation about the benefits and costs of distributed generation versus utility scale solar. I'm not going to go into that at this point. You know, I think they're both needed, but I did want to throw that one piece out there.
Okay.
So I'm speaking on behalf of CCSA because Caitlin was not able to make it today. She had a conflict. She was presenting in New York.
And just for people who are listening in, why don't you tell the audience what CCSA is?
Yeah, absolutely. So CCSA is the Coalition for Community Solar Access.
Okay, go ahead.
So we have been largely working with MREA on a lot of these issues. I wholeheartedly support the comments made by Jeremy. This has been a very challenging time for the industry, kind of trying to figure out you know, how we would propose to protect certain projects. You know, there's been a lot of investment made in Maine. I very much appreciate the comments made by Rep. Grohowski. We responded to signal sent by the market. You know, developers came in, and developers have a number of different business models. So, you know, there have been significant investments made. You know, industry is honestly, you know, struggling to figure out, even within itself, you know, how do you balance an interconnection services agreements with permitting with other milestones. So this is not an easy task that you have in front of you. You know, I guess I really just want to make a couple of points when we're thinking about it. You know, we have, as an industry, have coalesced around a couple of things. You know, one, there is significantly more than 760 megawatts of projects that have been invested in the state of Maine. You know, and invested in significantly, likely to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, I think that's important for this committee to understand and hear. You know, that there are projects that you know deserve a shot and feel that you know they have made those investments that they responded to signals made by the state and invested as a result of that. The second piece I would urge is that you know anything that comes out of this legislature, it really needs to have very clear guidance on who's in and who's out, so that investments can continue to be made very clearly. That is, you know, something that across the board folks have agreed on. And then the third is, you know, understanding that there is an NEB 2.0 and how quickly that will be rolled out, you know, will be very important. Because though that's kind of, you know, where folks go from here, you know, now what happens to the earlier stage projects? How do you transition and, you know, how does that work? In terms of some of the comments that were made on utility storage or really DG storage and how you add that to solar projects, I think generally, you know, the industry would be interested to hear the utilities perspective on that. You know, I think there are some challenges with adding storage to solar projects based on how the interconnection process is administered today. But you know, I don't think people are opposed to that if there was an appropriate incentive structure put in place. You know, some folks might be interested in that, some folks might not. And then the only other item that I think I'll add is that, you know, the upgrade of the grid, I think, as was mentioned by others, will definitely help with beneficial electrification for transportation. You know, we think that, you know, the work that we are doing both in distribution upgrades as well as, you know, the addition of actual capacity on the grid are beneficial to the future goals of Maine.
Great. Are there any questions for Michelle? Seeing none, thank you. So we're at 3:30 and I'm going to suggest you can beam Michelle back across, Jordan. I'm going to suggest some thoughts for next steps. For the four of us on the subcommittee, we have the information that Dan and Phil put together to process, to go through, to think about. I'm going to suggest we use the weekend to think about it, and each of us individually, and it's not a violation of committee rules if you want to call each other kind of one-on-one and talk about your ideas and kind of get some ideas to start to put some concrete ideas on where we would begin to draw lines in this. Not that anything is going to be hard and fast, but we need to begin to put some things on the table so we can see what they would actually look like. So that's what I'm going to ask each of you to do for your weekend homework assignment in all your free time. And I'm going to suggest, Deirdre, we put together a meeting sometime next week. EUT meets Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week. Is that correct?
Yes.
And are we all consuming the entire day those days?
I don't think so.
So what do you think?
Depends on what you do during work sessions. I mean, that falls on you a little bit. But let's see. I think, trying to think what's the better day. Give me 1 second here. I think Tuesday, because there's a wind bill hearing. I don't know if I'd count on that because I don't know how long that will wind up going. Offshore wind. Wednesday, you have 5 public hearings. And then Thursday, there are about 5 work sessions, but you've worked a few of those already. So Thursday may be the more flexible day where you might be able to get that stuff done rather quickly.
So I'm asking the subcommittee members, I'd like to do this rather sooner than later. What do you think about getting back together on Monday afternoon? You all have your mics on, right?
I don't feel that I'm going to have anything meaningfully new to contribute by Monday afternoon, quite frankly.
Thursday?
That seems more plausible for me, but.
Steve?
Yeah, as Deirdre said, she's learning about EUT, but she said Tuesday is actually, depending on how that goes, that might be the first opportunity, but Thursday's good for me, I guess, if that's what everybody wants.
Trey?
Yeah, I can do it. My last final is Monday morning. So after that, I'm free and clear.
Okay.
So as long as it's not Monday morning, I don't care.
So Thursday does put us out a bit. It puts us to, I believe, the 14th. Is that correct? And my goal is to get us all to make a recommendation back to EUT as a whole so we can get some clarity passed by the end of the month. So if we're going to go to Thursday, I'd ask you to start to specifically put some ideas down that you would suggest, some goals, some benchmarks, some where you would suggest beginning to do this. And it's fine if we don't end up, the 4 of us agreeing. We can have kind of a 2-prong report where we could go one option or the other option. I'd like to try to get us to agree, but I know sometimes we have very different philosophical perspectives, but we need to start putting something onto paper specifically on where we would be. I'm going to volunteer Deirdre's time to, if you need technical assistance in doing that. But I'd ask you for Deirdre to first of all, find a time on Thursday we can meet. And I'd like all of us to kind of begin to lay some cards on the table.
I mean, Thursday, it's hard for me to pick a definitive time for any of the days where you have committee work beforehand. So, I mean, I think we could shoot for a time, but it's unclear until you may take a half an hour to vote 5 bills, or you may take 7 hours to vote 5 bills or table them. So it's a little hard to say an exact time, but I think we could probably get a rough estimate. We could shoot for 1 or shoot for 2. And if we're not done, we'll just have to push it.
Give us a shoot for time.
Okay.
Go ahead, Steve.
So if we're going to, because of the request you've made for Thursday, I'm wondering if Commissioner Bartlett's still available. I was going to wait and ask this to provide the information for the next meeting, but I think he can probably very quickly tell me or tell us if we don't do anything. In other words, 1711 stays intact the way it is. You have bids out, or request for bids out. If we don't do anything, what happens? What do you project happening based on what happened in January?
And are you talking specifically, Steve, about rates?
No, I'm talking about the bids that will come in and what the PUC expects they might see, and how we would handle that if we have not adjusted NEB at all through this process.
Well, so there's 2 pieces. There's the DG procurement that we didn't accept the bids for, and that would be, we will have to go back out soon. And if the legislature hasn't acted, we will likely issue a procurement notice to go back out exactly the way we did before, but probably also with the caveat that if the legislature takes action, that we would suspend it. But so we would have to go out to a procurement and hope that this time it came back competitive. And then on the just regular NEB, it would just continue to move forward. And you have almost 2,500 megawatts that are in the queue, and it's anyone's guess how much would ultimately be able to move forward.
So I think we all understand we're going to do something, but I just want to kind of reiterate where we're at if we don't. So thank you.
Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, with that, we'll adjourn our meeting, but I just encourage you to kind of, if you want to do one-on-one calls with people and just bounce ideas off people's heads. And you should feel free to bother Phil or Dan too, if you want to, and ask thoughts and questions of them. If you don't have their cell phone numbers, I would suggest you get it. And this is a pretty big matter we're dealing with. So I'm offering up their time, kind of one-on-one, do what ifs scenarios in your minds. Okay. Well, thank you all for taking this time on Thursday. Deirdre will get on a Friday. Deirdre will get back to us with a shoot for time for next Thursday. And feel free to call me if you have any questions, thoughts, or ideas in the interim. Everybody, don't forget your mothers this weekend.
Right. Well, or you